Welcome, I'm Jocelyn Ajami and you're watching The Arabic Hour. Today we feature a profile of scholar, intellectual and activist Dr. Elaine Hagopian.
We simply grew up in an Arab community. I don't think I ever tasted a hamburger till I was 20. I look like this little quiet person. And I think they were stunned that I was arguing for due process, and they thought of me, therefore, as being very radical. If you ask me, would I want to live under any sectarian group? No, I wouldn't. But resistance is resistance. Palestine represents all of us.
Dr. Elaine C. Hagopian is Professor Emerita of Sociology at Simmons College, Boston. She received her PhD in Sociology and Anthropology from Boston University in 1962, and she served on Smith College faculty from 1962 to 1967, after which she joined Simmons College. She was the recipient of 2 Fulbright-Hays Faculty Research Grants to do research on Palestine and Lebanon, 1971 and 1983. She held a visiting professor appointment at the American University of Beirut and distinguished lecturer at American University of Cairo. Dr. Hagopian is the principal founder of the Trans-Arab Research Institute and former president of the Association of Arab American University Graduates, AAUG, and director pro tem of the Institute of Arab Studies. In 2000, she was the major organizer of the first historic conference on the right of return, Palestinian Refugees and a Durable Peace. Her most recent book as author and editor is Civil Rights in Peril, The Targeting of Arabs and Muslims, 2004, for which she received the Myers Outstanding Book Award. She has published numerous journal articles, book chapters, and book reviews related to Syria, Lebanon, and the Israel-Palestine conflict.
There is no written history that indicates that there was ever a conflict, a sustained conflict between Palestinian Arabs and people of the Jewish faith and background. And yet, in the 20th century, there has been a cycle of violence and intensity of emotion.
Professor Hagopian has led delegations to Egypt, Palestine, Jordan, and Lebanon. She's a frequent public speaker on Middle East issues, and she serves as the chief political interviewer for Arabic Hour Television in Boston. Elaine, welcome. Thank you so much for coming, and it's wonderful to see you on that side of the fence for a change.
Oh, thank you, Jocelyn. I'm not sure I'm happy to be on this side, but thank you.
Well, you're such a mainstay at the Arabic Hour. You practically are the Arabic Hour, so people are very familiar with you, but we'd like people to know more about you personally.
I was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right in the neighborhood of Huron Avenue and Appleton Street. My parents were both born in Syria. My mother did not know my father in Syria. He left actually before the Ottoman Empire fell. And he had a sister Victoria and a sister Mary, and his mother's name was Hasibe. He had 2 fathers, a stepfather and a biological father. And so one father died when he was 1. The stepfather died when he was 7. And so he really never knew either the Armenian or the Arab father. So he grew up with this Arab mother. But he left the area at the age of about 17 or 18 and took his mother and 2 sisters, and they went, what they thought they were going to the USA, they ended up in Brazil. How they got there, I don't know. How they ever got up here, it's not clear to me, but they somehow got into this area. My father worked first as a mechanic, and then he opened up this little grocery store, as a lot of Arabs did, in Cambridge on the corner of Huron and Appleton Streets. It was called the Handy Spa. He looked around for an Arab woman, heard about my mother, who migrated from Syria in 1924.
So you're both Syrian?
Yes.
So both sides?
Yes. And she went with her sister Mary and her mother to join her brothers in Cuba. My father heard about her, went to Cuba, courted her, letters were exchanged, went back down, got married in Cuba in a civil ceremony. And then they came up to New Jersey, where he had relatives, and got married in the Orthodox Church and settled in Cambridge. We actually first lived in a home on Granville Road, which was owned by a Syrian family, and it was basically a black neighborhood with working class Irish scattered around. It was a great neighborhood. After World War II, housing was a problem, so we moved up the street, bought a broken down house in a working class Irish neighborhood. The neighbors were not happy about this family moving in because they thought we were black. And we chose not to tell them differently, because we were not going to be accepted on the basis that we are theoretically white. My mother particularly was very friendly. She would say good morning to the neighbors every morning. They'd walk by. After I had gotten accepted in university, and I had received scholarships, and they did an article on me in the Cambridge Chronicle. The neighbor had read it, and she saw me one day, and she said, "Oh, I see that you're, getting into university and you have scholarships." And I said, "Yes, thank you." And we were talking, and I was expressing some concerns about American society. It was basically the McCarthy period. And she looked at me and she said, "Isn't it wonderful that a foreign person like you is interested in this country?" And I looked at her and I said, "I was born here. I'm an American. I was born here."
Did you feel yourself to be an Arab American from the beginning?
Yeah, so we knew that we were Arabs. Oh yes, and the way in which my mother kept up this kind of interaction was that she joined the St. Mary's Church, which originally was in downtown Boston, on where there were a lot of Arab communities. Now it's Chinatown, but that was called Little Syria at one time. And then the church moved to Cambridge on Inman Street. And the reason that she joined it, because she wasn't particularly religious, no one in my family is, was because she had a social life there. And she was with the ladies group, and she also was the only one who could write. She wrote in Arabic, and she kept all the notes in Arabic. So she was secretary of the group. And so we got to be a part not only of the church from very young, when it was in Boston to Cambridge, but of the Arab community, because they're all Arabs who went there. And we simply grew up in an Arab community. I don't think I ever tasted a hamburger until I was 20.
You went to college at Boston University?
Yes, I went to Boston University, and it was rather unusual how I went there, because I had no background in college preparation. When I was in high school, my father told me and told all of us that he did not have the money to send us to university. He did focus on my brother, because he was the man of the family, and he did work very hard to get my brother to go to college. And my brother was at Northeastern University, but he decided university was boring, and he quit. And turned out he was quite successful in the end. So he quit. I wanted to go to university, but I was trained as a secretary. I took a commercial course at Cambridge High in Latin. It's now Cambridge Rindge in Latin. And I was trained as I could run every kind of secretarial machine you could think of, accounting machine, not only typewriters. But I wanted to go, and I know when I graduated from high school, I was 17, and I looked for work, and I got work as a secretary. And I found that it was in a business, they were contractors, and they would get very upset when one of their bids wasn't accepted, and they would scream and yell. And I wasn't used to screaming and yelling, and I was very unhappy. And so I quit. I went to the owner and I said, I have to leave here. And I remember shaking and, 17 and hardly been out in the world, so to speak. And he said, but Elaine, why are you leaving? We like you. And I said, when you don't get a bid, you yell. And the guy looked at me, he sort of like, well, so what? And I said, I can't stand it. I left. And then I didn't know what to do with myself. And I would go into Boston and I would be looking for a job. I was make-believe I was looking for a job. I'd go into one movie, because they had movies in the morning and movie in the afternoon in those days. On Washington Street, there were all these movie houses. And I'd go out and have a bite to eat and go into another movie. And I did this for 2 weeks. And, a family began to get onto it. My mother's sister, Mary, who was married but never had children, came to me one day and she said, what is it you really want to do? And I said, I really want to go to college. And she said, well, if you can get in, I will pay your first year and you have to pay me back, but you're on your own. And I said, all right. So I went over, and it was summer. And the applications have been closed, acceptances have been, and I went over to BU admissions, and I at the time I remember, and I said, I would like to apply to come in to BU. And they said, well, you have to take the college boards, and I said, well, I can't pass them. It had to have Latin, you had to have advanced math, you had to have, classical history. You had to have all these things at that time, and the college boards were the equivalent of the SATs. And I didn't have any of those. I was a wizard at being, just a wizard being a secretary. So they, in any case, they said, well, what makes you think you can go to college? And I said, well, I think I can do well, and I'm very interested. I really want to understand the world. And they said, do you have any money? And I said, no, but my aunt will pay my first year. And I said, what do you have to lose? Take me in for a semester. If I don't make it, I don't make it. And BU did. They put me in a special program. And after the first semester, I succeeded. After that semester, I was accepted as a regular student and went on to do an undergraduate major in sociology and a lot of philosophy. And then when I finished with that, my father, who was still living at the time, said to me, well, what do you want to do? You've gotten through college. And he felt bad that he couldn't pay for my college. But I worked three jobs, and I got some scholarships. And I drove for a woman on Brattle Street because she wanted a woman driver. I cleaned toilets at night at BU in a lounge, and I did typing. Everybody wanted my typing because I could type as fast as you could think. And so I did those three jobs, and we didn't have a car. I'd come back and forth by public transportation, which was fine. And then, so my father, after a while, he said, well, you're graduating, and he always got a kick about talking to me about politics, and I always just say, I don't know as much as you, Daddy. But he said, well, I know someone who can get a job teaching in Everett. And so I went and I looked, and I said, this is not what I want to do. This is not yet what I want to do. And so I applied for graduate school, also at BU, because I had to live at home.
So Elaine, after all that, and then you pursue a PhD.
I did go on
at BU.
At BU.
Remarkable.
And then I got a Ford Foundation grant to do research for my doctorates, which was on Morocco. Morocco was getting independent at the time, and Then when I graduated, I accepted a position at Smith College.
I wanted to ask you about Smith. You were at Smith 5 years.
Yes.
And from 62 to 67.
Yes.
And what was that experience like, and did you have any mentors?
Well, when I was teaching at Smith, I must confess that I really was wondering what I was doing there. I'm a working class person. What am I doing here? I just didn't seem to fit until I walked through this library, and there was a man at a bubbler. It was the first day that I was there, and he was drinking all this water and drinking water and drinking water. And I thought to myself, that guy must be an Arab. He's drinking all this water because, we do a lot of salt and pepper and we drink a lot of water. And then he looked up at me, and he had blazing blue eyes, and he was dark complected, and he said to me, you're the Syrian girl. And I thought, well, I said, yeah, well, who are you? I mean, yeah. He says, come. I said, where? He says, there's 3 of us. I said, 3 what? He said, there are 3 Arabs at Smith. So that turned out to be Ibrahim Abulud, who had also come that year with his wonderful wife, Janet, a brilliant woman who completed her doctorates while she was there and having her 4th child. I became part of that family.
Did you have any idea of his importance at that moment, or did that evolve?
No, I didn't. No, I didn't. All I knew was that I really was thrilled there was an Arab there, and I was really thrilled that that he was a friend and a mentor, and he cared about how people thought about Arabs. And he had a lot of pride and dignity, and he was extraordinarily intelligent. And after 5 years, Brahim left and went to Northwestern University out in Evanston, Illinois, and I left and found a job in the Boston area at Simmons College, which was another women's institution, and I definitely wanted to be back in Boston. I didn't want to accept any other job outside. I wanted to be back in Boston area. And I went to live on Harvard Street in Cambridge, and so I stayed at Simmons from 1967 until I retired.
But in 1967 was a pretty crucial year in the Middle East, and you were teaching sociology, anthropology, but you were also involved with the African American studies. So how did 1967 affect you and your courses?
First, it was my first year of teaching at Simmons, and the war in the Middle East had broken out. Israel had destroyed really the Arab armies in a few days, and I recall that I was very distressed, and I was looking around for someone to speak to this great injustice, and I got a call from Brahim, and he said, well, we're going to be establishing an organization of people who are professionals, predominantly academics, in order to confront the injustice and the mendacious narrative put out by the Zionists, and that it was long overdue. And so the Association of Arab American University Graduates was formed. Now, at that time, I also, while I was speaking on anti-Vietnam and the civil rights movement was going on, and I was supportive of that, and we were all running back and forth to Washington, I began speaking on the Middle East. And I had studied African studies, but I also knew the Middle East. I got to know it better. And because my father had always impressed upon me that I must always remember Palestine because it was a great injustice. So I had this idea of always justice, and he had imbued in me the whole idea that Palestine was not just Palestine. It represented a larger issue of an underdog. And the right of third world people to their own country and control over their own lives. And so he told me Palestine represents all of us. So that came back to me. And when I began to speak in the Boston area about the Middle East, I was stunned. I didn't realize how volatile it was. And I found that when I would speak, there would be articles in local newspapers. For example, I spoke up in Andover one day, and it was in one of the local newspapers. There was an article quoting me in ways I had never spoken that way. And what I found was that apparently I was being followed around by Zionists who actually wrote the article the way they wanted, and it was published by them. And I really, the mail began to pour into the college. It was my first year there, and I thought for sure that I was a goner. I hadn't quite realized it was such a volatile question. But anyway, the president sent the vice president to see me, and with all these negative letters. In the end, they stood by me. They answered all those letters. Turned out that the president of Simmons College, family were missionaries in the Middle East, and they were part of the founders of International College in Beirut. And he told me, I understand Zionism. And he said, if people don't want to give their contributions, because the alums who were of Jewish background were contacted on the basis that I was somehow a danger to be at Simmons. And he upheld academic freedom. He knew my work, and so I was secured at Simmons College. And I was very fortunate because many people got fired.
Now, while all this is happening, you're active with AAUG, and do you think that it was conceived also as a lobby, as a counter-narrative? And
it was, we had not thought in terms of it being a lobby. It was really conceived as an organization that had several duties. Number one, we understood that the average Arab American, first of all, we didn't know where they were. I mean, we knew some of the communities, but we didn't know how many were there, how many new people had come. Probably were emotionally concerned about Palestine, but didn't really understand the issues. So we felt we needed to educate them as well as the public. Second, we thought that there was no point in being a lobby, because number one, we didn't have numbers yet, and we didn't know where the community was. There were no computers at the time, and in any case, to be a lobby, you have to be sufficiently sure that the Arab world, or at least the segments that are hostile to the U.S., would suddenly become friendly to the U.S. I mean, the U.S. favors the Israeli lobby because Israel had up to a certain point, and maybe changing now, been considered an ally and an asset. And what did the Palestinians have to offer? They had nothing to offer, nor would we, as independent Arab Americans, even want to speak in that way, because we could not represent them. But we also felt it was unjust. It was just simply unjust, and that wasn't acceptable. And so we spoke to the justice. The most important thing we did was to confront the mendacity of the Zionist narrative. The Zionists were used to having the whole public at their feet. They had no competitors. And that doesn't mean over the earlier history there weren't a few people here and there who did speak up. They did. But they had never had an articulate group, and these were people in AAUG who were predominantly intellectuals and professionals, doctors, lawyers, businessmen, but they predominantly also came from the Arab world and became citizens here in the 50s and 60s. So they left the Arab world when things had gotten really rotten and difficult, but they knew the injustice, and they were educated. And many of them had been educated here. the older community had come for economic reasons and really didn't understand what was happening in Palestine, didn't understand the issues. And so it was, AAUG was predominantly led by these people. And there were a few of us who were born here, who were actually early on involved with the association, with writing, with speaking, and being out front and confronting this narrative and really doing our homework. I mean, we worked very hard to make sure that all our facts were accurate.
I was going to ask you if AAUG had been pressured or had any kind of action taken against it and how you dealt with that.
Yes, AAUG had many problems when the Zionists realized that we were a group that had articulate people, and by this time Edward Said had become a member. Brahim was the real leader. Abdin Jabbar was a lawyer born here also. I mean, there were just so many people who were just so bright. We had Egyptians, we had Iraqis, we had Syrians, we had people of all different backgrounds. It was really cooperated as an Arab group. We began to get a real reaction of nasty notes, nasty phone calls. Many of us unlisted our numbers, and of course attempts at our universities and our jobs to get us fired and things of this sort. And our group was called Arab American University Graduates, and they would come around to different homes of speakers, like Nasir Aruri, for example. FBI would come, and they'd hold up a sheet and say, you know, early in the morning, we have evidence that you were a member of Fatah or something of this sort. They had no evidence. And it was all a scare tactic. It was Abdin Jabbar, as a lawyer, who began to inform the community, and including Arab students who were at MIT, Harvard, and everywhere, of their rights under the American Constitution, of their civil rights. And so we confronted this, but it was a rough period, and but Operation Boulder really never went away. They began to prevent Arab intellectuals from coming here, and very much like the Patriot Act.
So history repeats itself.
Yes, yes,
it's
and elaborates, yes.
Exactly, and elaborates, you're so right. In 71, while, you know, your AAUG now, in 67's passed, in 71 you get your first Fulbright-Hays Research Fellowship, and you go to Lebanon to study Palestinian national identity and the impact of it on Arab national thought, which is a big task, huge task. Was that your first time in Lebanon, and carry us through that experience?
Yes, actually, it was strange that, having been raised so Arab, this grant, this my first Fulbright-Hays grant, really allowed me to go there. I mean, I grew up in an Arab community, but no one ever went back. If we went anywhere, we went to Cuba to see my grandmother and my uncles, and so that's, you know, that was the draw. I was the only one, and remained the only one in the family that went to the Arab world. So I went to Lebanon, and I was in fact researching the impact of the Palestinian resistance on Arab national thought.
You had a dream, I think, about resettling to Lebanon. What happened to that? Because then you go back in 73 to 74 to teach at the American University of Beirut, and there's war again.
I actually had hoped to stay there. I had developed some very strong relations, and then a lot of people that I knew got killed, and so it just didn't work out. Also, my family, I never did tell them at the time that I was interested in staying in Lebanon. They would have had a nervous breakdown, I think. But it was very, very specific relationships that somehow were destroyed by the whole constant bombing of the area by Israel. I mean, you never got in the newspapers here. You know, they'd come in and bomb the the camps almost daily. And you would never hear about it in this country.
It must have been really traumatic to see some of your friends be killed, and I mean, it must have been devastating. Was there anyone in particular, one particular story that you'd want to share with us?
Well, the one that touched me deeply was Ghassan Kanafani. He was the spokesperson for the Palestinian Front for Liberation. He was one of the greatest thinkers ever. He was a novelist. He was 36 years old when I met him in 1971 in his office. And he explained to me the position of their group, which was really over-encompassing on gender issues. He wanted to solve these all at one time. He didn't want to have the revolution first and then afterwards we think about women. No, he wanted to deal with that all at one time. I had a fantastic interview with him, and then we were leaving, and he insisted to drive me back to where I was staying, as it was quite late in the night. And when we went down, he got very upset, and I said, well, you know, what's upsetting you? He said, look at those guys. There were several men. They were sitting, they were smoking, playing backgammon, and drinking coffee. He said, they're supposed to be watching my car. He said, you know, this is our problem. We cannot match the task assigned with the time. And they are not looking at my car, and that's what they're supposed to do. Well, he drove me home, and it was in the same car the following year that when he was leaving for work and he was driving his niece, Lamis, to school presumably, he turned on the ignition and he was blown up. This was Israel's work. Israel was the first car bomb in Lebanon. Blew him up into a million pieces at the age of 36, 37 years old. One of the finest minds. They knew what they were killing. He was the most brilliant of all the Palestinian leaders. So that story deeply touches me, and I go back to it often.
How was it teaching at the American University of Beirut?
Well, teaching at AUB was wonderful and also really distressing. When I got there, the classes started, and the campus was beautiful, and I was thrilled. It was just a whole wonderful experience. I met some of the students. Actually, I found one of my cousins there, and it led me to other cousins in Lebanon. And but then the October War, the war happened. Well, back at the AUB during this period, the students were so upset by this war because they knew that Sadat was ready to concede the cause to the Americans and the Israelis. And I recall with such clarity that the students, first they gathered in the area of College Hall. The Lebanese special forces were up on top, and they were telling the students to disperse. And they, I came up with some of the other American professors. The Arab professors were a little bit concerned about getting fired because it was American administration. And with the bullhorn, I was telling the students to please disperse because there were people up there ready to shoot. And they were shouting, "Sadat traitor, Sadat traitor, Sadat traitor," and they wouldn't disperse. And the bullets started to come down. One young man was hit in the leg, and we picked him up and we carried him to the American University hospital, which was up the street, and the firing stopped, and the hospital was really weird. They wouldn't take the boy until we paid them. And none of us had money on us, and I went running back to my apartment, which was at the foot of AUB, Falaha building, right near the ocean, the sea. And I got some money and I went running back up and paid them, and they, finally dealt with the kid was bleeding from his leg. They finally dealt with him. It was a really weird experience. Hadim Barakat, who was teaching at the time in the sociology department, and myself did a series of interviews with them, which was subsequently published as a chapter in a book on the new generation of Arabs. But I remember going to a faculty meeting, and the dean at the time was a fellow by the name of Eddie Salam, and he was concerned about this occupation. They had brought in special forces who bivouacked in West Hall on campus, and they were forcing students to go to class even when students didn't have a class, and they were hitting people. And I remember I got hit trying to save one young man that was being hit on the head. Just tell him, take him and go put him in jail, but for God's sakes, don't hit him on the head. So they cracked my arm for me. But I remember standing up in the faculty meeting when they were trying to decide what to do about these students. Some of them were arrested and whatnot. And I argued for due process. I simply said, you must have due process. I'm not saying that students are right. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm not saying any of this. I'm arguing for due process. And I was basically told to sit down. And I was then, the chairman of the department then came to me. He was the acting chairman. His name was Fuad Hori. And he said to me, you really don't know much about Lebanon and things here, and you shouldn't, speak up, and you're only here for a year. I said, listen, I'm a faculty member. I have a right to vote. I'm not even interfering in Lebanese politics. I'm not talking about whether the students are right or wrong. What I am arguing for is due process. We had just finished having all these student things in the United States, and we had many hearings on that, and we all argued for due process. In any case, it was interesting because they had, when I first got there, they had already offered me a job for the long term. And I considered it, but not for long, because I thought, this is not the university that was founded, when it was founded. This has now become part of the politics of the area. And I didn't know if I wanted to be there. And I remember saying no, and then after all this happened, I think they were so relieved that I had said no, because I look like this little quiet person. And I think they were stunned that I was arguing for due process, and they thought of me, therefore, as being very radical. And that I think they were relieved that I had said no, and I think, in any case, if I had said yes, I think they wouldn't have hired me.
You have been watching a profile of Dr. Elaine Hagopian, well-known activist, intellectual, scholar, and political interviewer for the Arabic Hour. Please join us next time for the conclusion of our profile on Dr. Hagopian. You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org. You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org. are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org. Thank you so much for joining us. Some stations will be leaving us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. For those of you staying with us for the remainder of the hour, we hope you enjoy the last musical segment following the closing credits. On behalf of all the volunteers here at the Arabic Hour, I'm Jocelyn Ajami, and we look forward to seeing you next week. The Arabic Hour has been brought to you in part by the William G. Abdullah Memorial Library, a resource center for information and education on the Arab American experience. The American Arabic Benevolent Association, ABA, an umbrella association for community endeavors. The Nicholas G. Barham Veterans Association and Ladies Auxiliary, providing veteran services, scholarships with community pride. And by our members as well as contributions from viewers like you.